Did you ever get a feeling that we are a people who are destined to be at war? Do you ever wonder if it is somewhere or somehow predetermined that the Jewish people will be locked in violent struggle with oppressors one generation after the next, as the Passover Haggadah predicts, B'chol dor vador omdim aleinu lechalotenu, that it seems like in every generation there is someone waiting in the wings to rise up against us, to attack us, to harm us, to destroy us. I got that feeling this week. We open the Parsha today to the book of Numbers, which is, of course, named for the opening episode, which is a census. But this is no ordinary census. This is not just a counting of heads. This is a census for a purpose. What's the purpose? To number all of those who are eligible to fight. It's a national roll call, a mustering of troops for battle. Kol zachar mibein 20 shana v'ma'ala kol yotzei tzava. The Torah tells us exactly who's being counted. All males, 20 years or older, who are able to bear arms. Yotzei tzava. That word tzava is the same word used to this day to describe the army of the modern state of Israel. Tzava Haganah Yisrael. That's the tza in Tzahal. So from the book of Numbers, Parashat Bamidbar, to this very day, it seems like the Jewish people have been unceasingly preparing to defend ourselves, to fight, to protect our lives, our land, our heritage. Do we want this? Did we ask for this? It's exhausting. I don't know how you feel. After opening the newspaper every day this week, watching CNN every day this week, refreshing the Times of Israel each day this week, maybe each hour. It's exhausting. And it's not healthy. Just like they tell us that being angry or depressed or stressed out all the time has ramifications for our physical health. High blood pressure, weight gain, heart problems, upset stomach, loss of sleep, you've heard it. This chronic condition of always being on the defensive is detrimental to the metaphysical health of the Jewish people. On Monday, Ezra came home from school. We were having our regular banter about his day. He's telling me about his classes and about whatever happened in school that day, his social life. And in the midst of conversation, Ezra mentions that they had recited Hallel that morning at school at the Berman Hebrew Academy. And I interrupted his review of the day and I said, wait a minute, you said Hallel today? Remember this conversation? He said, of course we said Hallel. It's Yom Yerushalayim. Didn't you? I was shocked, frankly, and a little bit embarrassed to realize that we had not said Hallel that morning. That series of psalms of praise and rejoicing that are added to most Jewish holidays in our morning minyan here at Har Shalom. Jacob, why didn't you say anything? Just kidding, don't answer. I thought to myself, how could we have omitted that? Actually, the thought didn't even occur to me. Did it occur to you, Toby?
Well, Women's League did it at noon. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll tell you, I felt temporarily relieved when I went back to this red Sidur Shim Shalom, opened the Sidur and read the italicized instructions at the bottom of the page that said, some congregations recite Hallel on Yom Yerushalayim. I guess everyone at the morning minyan that day just assumed that we were one of the congregations that didn't. Jacob is giving me the thumbs up. But that momentary relief soon turned into frustration, and I'll tell you why. Because I want to say Hallel on Yom Yerushalayim. I believe strongly in the miraculous events of that day, that most modern holiday. I can't imagine what it must have been like to live in Jerusalem between the years of 1948 and 1967. Very different from the Jerusalem today. It was a city divided down the middle, just like Berlin used to be and other cities, divided between a Jewish sector and the Jordanian military occupation that controlled the entire old city, which meant no access for Jews to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, no access to Jews to other holy sites. When Israeli forces entered the old city after defeating the Jordanians in the Six-Day War, they found Jerusalem in shambles. 58 synagogues were desecrated. Some of them turned into animal stalls and chicken coops to add insult to injury. The streets were cluttered. The charm and character of the old city befouled and overgrown. Just on the other side of the valley, gravestones on the Mount of Olives, a Jewish cemetery for 2,500 years. Can you imagine a cemetery like that? It's even older than the ones out in Queens. 2,500 years of Jewish graves. And some of those gravestones were used as pavers and latrines for the Arab Legion. In the years since 1967, Jerusalem has literally experienced a resurrection. Holy sites are open and accessible to everyone. Shops and markets, at least before Corona, were filled with merchants and patrons. The city is alive with commerce and culture and Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, new construction, the sounds of Jewish life, and also, by the way, the sounds of church bells and Islamic prayer calls that together fill the holy air of that place. It is a miracle that Jerusalem was once again reborn. A miracle worthy of reciting Hallel. It's funny, I know downtown Jerusalem better than I know downtown Cleveland. I lived in Cleveland for the first 18 years of my life, and the only time I ever went downtown was for sporting events. The rest of my life was spent exclusively in the suburbs. I've lived in the DC area now for over 10 years, and I'm only a little bit embarrassed to acknowledge that every time I go into the city, I use Waze. But the streets and neighborhoods of Jerusalem are more recognizable to me than anywhere else in the world. I love that city in a familiar and an intimate way. I lived there. I've returned countless times to visit, to study, and to bring groups of newcomers who have also fallen in love with that place. And I'm in awe of what a rebuilt and reunified Jerusalem represents for the Jewish people and for the state of Israel. So why wasn't I in more of a festive mood on Monday? I've been asking myself that question all week. The truth is, I've been watching a growing throng of Arab protesters rally every night in front of the Damascus Gate. That's one of the portals to the city that most Jews never enter because it goes directly into the Muslim quarter. I've watched those demonstrations grow in heat and intensity every day. The Sheikh Jarrah debacle was meant to be a provocation, and it worked. There's no doubt that ultra-nationalist Jews want to displace Arabs from their homes in East Jerusalem. That's true. Some of their leaders, like Itamar Ben-Gvir, have espoused xenophobic hate speech that makes me cringe as a Jew, as a Zionist, as a human being. I condemn that in no uncertain terms. I've also watched the unrest on the Temple Mount during Ramadan. But let me tell you something. When I come to shul to pray, I bring my talit, my tefillin, my siddur. I do not bring Molotov cocktails or rocks or ammunition. The Arabs on the Temple Mount were not simply worshipers. It was intended to be something different. And even if you think that Israeli security responded with too much force, it seems undeniable that this gathering was never intended to be peaceful. In these past several days, I've seen as Arabs posted on TikTok videos encouraging people to attack a Jew. And I have watched as a frenzy of Jews have chanted death to Arabs while parading through the streets with huge Israeli flags. The ripple effect of this mutual hatred and mistrust has now extended to various cities and towns across the country, particularly those which had a history of Arab and Jewish coexistence. Those towns are now filled with looting and riots and street violence and fires and gangs of each side looking and prowling for the other to engage in fights. You remember our friend Chezi? You remember Chezi? Our shaliach from before Yael? So I talked to him the other day, checked in with him, wanted to know how he was doing. And he said, it's becoming scary to walk on the streets. And you know, Chezi is a big guy. He's a big guy. He's a combat soldier. Said it's becoming scary to walk on the streets. Chezi said, I participated in 2 wars. And I've never felt so afraid in my own country. That's Chezi Shmueli. So maybe you can understand why I wasn't in such a festive mood on Monday. And then, of course, there is Hamas, Yemach Shemam, a terrorist junta that doesn't give a whit about shedding blood and doesn't give a whit about whether the blood that's shed is Palestinian or Jewish. You must be aware that of the thousands of rockets that have been shot into Israel, 300 of them malfunctioned and fell right back down in Gaza, killing and injuring Palestinians. While the Palestinian Authority postponed yet another election, Mahmoud Abbas is entering the 16th year of his 4-year term, and simultaneously dithers away in irrelevance, it is Hamas, which does not believe in coexistence, does not believe in negotiation, does not believe in peace. This is not an opinion. This is not a feeling. Go on the computer after Shabbat and Google the Avalon Project, which is a collection of national documents, constitutions, declarations of independence from all over the world. Key political documents from every country and national movement in the world. And right there, in an unbiased, I believe it's sponsored by Yale University, you can read the Hamas Charter in all of its ugliness. I'm not stating an opinion. Hamas believes in the total annihilation of the state of Israel. Period. Full stop. And it is that movement in the midst of this leadership vacuum that has inserted itself as the voice of the Palestinian movement. With every rocket they fire into Israel, Hamas claims that it's defending Al-Aqsa, defending Islam, defending the Palestinian resistance, all while its leaders bunker themselves under the Shifa hospital. You know what that is? The biggest hospital in Gaza City. And in the basement, they issue their orders because they know that Israel won't fire on a hospital. So Israelis are running again between their beds and bomb shelters. Such terrible stories of elderly people who trip and fall and hit their heads and can't get to the shelters in time. The IDF is again bombing Gaza. Kol zachar mi ben esrim shana v'mala kol yotzei tzava. There's that pasuk again from our Torah portion. The IDF mustered along the Gaza border. If it feels like we've been here before, it's because we have. Only this time the extremists seem more emboldened than ever. The rockets are more numerous and travel further than ever before. The violence has spilled into Israel's streets and cities more egregiously than ever before, and the lack of real leadership is more evident now than ever before. In my various travels and meetings in the region, I've become friendly with the Palestinian guy. He used to be a militant, spent a lot of time in Israeli prisons, and then came to the realization that none of that's going to work, and now has become an outspoken peace activist. His name is Osama, and he lives in Jericho. And I messaged him on Facebook the other day, wanted to know how he was doing, how his family was doing. This is what he said. It's even more difficult when you feel part of both peoples. I don't feel like anyone is winning anything. That's what he said. Both are fighting over who's the boss. Remember, English is not his first language. And that's sad. I feel like my brothers and sisters are fighting each other. And he ended by saying, pray for us, my dear friend, for all of us. In this past week, I've hardly been able to think about anything but Israel. And I came to the following conclusions for myself. Now, don't get mad at me, please. Don't send me hate mail tonight or tomorrow. I'm just telling you how I have been able to cope and make sense of what's going on. These don't have to be your conclusions. I'm sorry I had the microphone and you don't, but you have your own platforms. I don't want to hear about another ceasefire. I want to hear real proposals for lasting peace. Ceasefires are getting a little exhausting. I don't want to be lectured about how Jews are colonialists or apartheiders or interlopers or oppressors, but I also don't want to hear that Palestinians are fake and should just move to one of the other 22 Arab countries in the world. Guess what? That's a pipe dream, and it ain't ever going to happen. And the sooner that we realize that, the better. There are over 300,000 Arabs who live and work and have spouses and children and grandchildren and families who yearn to live normal lives in a modicum of dignity in the city of Jerusalem, which is a city they also deeply love, and a city they also have lived in for centuries. And the sooner the pro-Israel community comes to terms with that, the better. And I certainly don't want to be told by some teenage influencer on Instagram to swipe up and see the whole conflict explained in one post that fits within the 5 inches of my iPhone screen. I'm sorry, folks, but it's a little more complicated than that. And I don't want to hear one more word, not one word, from Trevor Noah. Trevor, for God's sake, stick to comedy. You're good at that. But being a pundit on Israel and Palestine, not so much. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it. And please don't anybody tell me that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself when it's being showered by rockets on a daily basis. There is not any other country in the world, not one, that would stand for repeated invasions on civilian populations like that. But I also don't want to hear that the status quo is really the best we can do for the Palestinians because, after all, there's just no one to talk to. If we weren't in shul, I would follow that up with an epithet that wouldn't be appropriate. You know what that is? That's a convenient excuse for doing nothing. It's an excuse that's been used by the current government and prime minister for far too long, in my humble opinion. There are plenty of people to talk to on both sides. It reminds me of the story of the Lubavitcher Rabbi, who was asked once if the mezuzah on a child's room should be placed low down on the doorpost where the child could reach it when the child comes in and out, or higher on the top third where mezuzah normally is placed. The Rebbe said it should be placed on the top third of the doorposts, and that the child's parents should lift the child up to reach it. We should be a people who lift others up, who elevate discourse and dialogue rather than bending down to the lowest expectations. As the Israeli philosopher Daniel Hartman wrote this week, I am angry that we are not striving to be better, smarter, more just, more hopeful, more visionary. I am angry because over and over again we choose narratives that contribute to our moral mediocrity. Are we a people that's supposed to have moral mediocrity? And elevate a bad and unsustainable status quo. After all those tribes are listed in the Parsha along with their leaders, their flags, their placement in the Israelite camp, the Torah says, and we heard it, I think, in the 6th or 7th Aliyah, Kain chanu v'chein nasa'u. I think the Chazan read that. Kain chanu v'chein nasa'u. Those words mean the tribes would travel in the same exact formation as they set up camp, where they were located around the Mishkan. When they camped, they would travel in the same way. They wouldn't move or change locations. Now, there's a Hasidic interpretation attributed to Rabbi Meir Apta, 19th century Polish Hasidic rabbi, who said that this expression means that the character of how they camped defined their journey. The values of how they lived together, how they dwelled together, how they coexisted together, determined how they traveled forward together. Now, if that was true of the ancient tribes that inhabited the land of Israel, how much more so is it true of the modern tribes that inhabit the very same land? The values, the ideals, the standards of how we dwell together will determine our future travels together. That should either make us shudder with fear or fill us with hope. This is a pivotal moment for these peoples. And I pray today that God identifies leaders who will help us camp together, dwell together, and journey together toward a future of dignity and respect and abiding peace for everyone who lives in that land. For the sake of everything we hold dear about Israel, for the sake of everything that we believe about Zionism, and for the sake, frankly, of the future of the Jewish people, Kain Yehi Ratzon, we beg you, God, that this be your will. Amen. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Sing with me. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam shalom. Salam aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam shalom. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam shalom. Salam aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam. Shalom.